Today's talk is going to be about the editors of the First Folio of William Shakespeare. I'll begin with a few facts. It is thought that between 500 and 1,500 folios were printed. According to Peter Blaney, one of the experts thinks it was 750, and Charlton Hinman believes it was 1,000. So nobody knows for sure, but each folio had about 900 pages. It contained 36 plays. Of the 36 plays, between 18 and 20 were unpublished at the time. 3 plays were totally unknown, and if they hadn't popped up in the First Folio, we would never know that 3 very important plays ever existed. So it can't be overstated how important the First Folio was. About 235 First Folios are known today, and of those, only 40 are considered complete. The question that I'm going to address in this talk is who actually edited the First Folio, and actually did he have some help with what we might consider today an editorial advisory board, or did he operate all alone? In 2016, the Folger Shakespeare Library made a tour, took around the United States of some of their very important, very fine and valuable First Folios. And they set up an exhibit in many colleges and universities across the country. The accompanying materials did not even mention Ben Jonson's name, though it had been thought in generations past that Ben Jonson was the editor of the First Folio. The Folger, however, gave all of the credit to 2 actors. Their names were John Heminges and Henry Condell. Sometimes the First Folio was even called the Heminges and Condell edition. Now, to clear up this little problem, I sent a question in to the Folger Shakespeare Library through their Ask a Librarian portal to ask them, well, who edited the First Folio? And this is exactly what the librarian sent to me. The answer to your question is that there wasn't an editor in the way that we would think of such. For the 1623 folio, the plays were brought together by Shakespeare's friends and theater colleagues, John Heminges and Henry Condell, and printed by Isaac Jaggard and Edward Blount. But none of these people intervened in the text the way a modern editor would. They simply gathered and set the text as it was given. What I'm going to do in the rest of this talk is to study the historical context surrounding this First Folio, this now extremely valuable book in our time today, and see how well this stands up to a closer look. Now, the reason for the actors' names is that in the introductory material to the First Folio, called either the prefatory material, sometimes it has a fancy word, they call it the paratext, which are dedications and tributes and such as that, and information that the reader might want to know before they delve into the First Folio all those centuries ago. They had an epistle dedicatoire, and it is at the end of this dedicatory epistle are the 2 actors' names printed there, John Heminges and Henry Condell. Now there's one little thing that they don't tell you. The 2 names are misspelled. Funny, though they believe that the actors composed the dedication here, but it's funny that they would have not put their names on correctly as the names appear on the wills of these people a few years later. Heminges has an S at the end of his name, and Henry Condell is actually Henry Condell, but they didn't get it quite right. Another part of the introduction is this to the great variety of readers. And if you look down here really tiny, you see John Heminges and Henry Condell. Again, their names not spelled the way they would have spelled them. Now, what supports the idea, the proposal, that these 2 actors actually composed the material that their names are on? Is there anything? What education did they have? What sort of experience with writing or editing or publishing might have equipped the 2 actors, who I'm sure were very good actors, but what would have equipped them to do the job with the First Folio? Nothing. 0. Charlton Auburn, in his book, The Mysterious William Shakespeare, states these issues very well with this attribution of editorship to Heminges and Condell. He says, "We do not know why the King's Men, the acting company, would let 2 of the members appropriate so valuable a property and dispose of it on their own. We do not know how 2 actors would have raised the small fortune for such a publishing venture, and we do not know why anyone putting putting up the funds would have left the immensely important task of editing the 36 plays to two, quote, undistinguished stage players with no experience to fit them for the work. Speaking of the cost, how much did it cost to put together the First Folio? I'm going to use as a comparator the King James Version of the Bible because it came from the same time frame in the Jacobean era. If you look, the King James Bible was published in 1611, and about 10 years later, actually less than that we think, but we'll go with these dates, the Shakespeare First Folio was under production in press off and on about 10 years later. But so generally, it was a while back, but we're still looking at the same general time frame. If I checked with the Oxford University historian Alistair McGrath, who is one of the experts on the King James Version of the Bible, and he has this to say about the cost of the Bible. A substantial financial investment had to be made on the outset for the printer's type and the other production cost. The printer did not have the £3,500, which would be over $3 million in today's money, over £3,500 set aside and could turn it, and so he turned to what was called venture capital to fund the King James Bible. Can you imagine this great religious work funded by venture capital? Since the King James Bible was funded by venture capital, I think it would not be a stretch to say that the First Folio of Shakespeare was very likely funded by venture capital. Charlton Hinman agrees. Charlton Hinman, in one of the most important books about the First Folio, which is the Norton facsimile of the First Folio, and he is the editor of it. In his introduction to it, he has this to say about the expense of this book and getting it together. The mere presence of Shakespeare's name on the title page of such an edition, as the publisher of one of them in Quarto tells us, was enough to ensure rapid sale. But a folio edition of 36 plays was another matter entirely. It would call for a considerable outlay of capital, would take a long time to produce, and the First Folio was in press and being printed for off and on for almost 2 years, and would hardly, when finished, be in great popular demand. It was would be just too expensive. He goes on to say that the folio was a decidedly chancy venture, and one that was not likely to appeal to many publishers of the time unless some kind of guarantee against disastrous loss could be made. Nobody liked to lose money then as now. And he goes on to say, of course, we know nothing of such guarantee, but it is inescapable that the brothers who bore the dedication were the only parties involved in the folio production who were in a financial position to bear the cost. So who are we talking about? Who do we think, and Charlton Hinman agrees, as one of the greatest experts in the 20th century, that here's our epistle dedicatoire, and I hope it's showing up clearly enough that it is dedicated to two earls, the Earl of Pembroke, who is William, and his younger brother Philip, who is the Earl of Montgomery. And they are called the most noble and incomparable pair of brethren. So who are these guys? William, the Earl of Pembroke, and Philip, the Earl of Montgomery. William was the Lord Chamberlain of the king's household. Anybody who wanted a meeting, any ambassador coming in, any great personage, no matter who they were, they had to go through William, the Earl of Pembroke, to set up a meeting if they wanted to meet with King James. He was very definitely the equivalent of today's modern day Chief of Staff of the White House Chief of Staff, William. Philip, his younger brother, was called the Gentleman of the King's Bedchamber, and these people were the closest advisors, the most powerful advisors that King James had, according to two of his most important biographers of the king who know about this. So both of these held extremely high and mighty and important positions in King James' royal administration. If you wanted to talk to have an audience with the king, you needed to talk to him, and if the king wanted to discuss it afterwards, he talked to the younger brother. So being on their good side was a pretty good idea. So what do we know? I'm getting back to Ben Jonson, and some of you, if you're relatively new to this, those of you who've been with us a long time, of course, know all about Ben Jonson and his relationship to Pembroke and Montgomery. But if you're new to him, and how does he fit into this First Folio thing, you might ask? Well, I'm using these three biographies of Ben Jonson from the latter part of the 20th century, and this one is actually the most recent. For all of the information I'm going to give you about Ben Jonson, because they're all very fine historians that have composed these biographies and researched them very well. Ben Jonson's presence is immediately seen the instant someone opens the first page of the First Folio. They will see the very familiar engraving. Everybody sees this in your mind's eye. You hold this drosh out, this is the image, and directly across from it, to the reader, is Ben Jonson, B.I., the person who composed this. The I stands for J, because they didn't have a J in printing back then. This is Ben Jonson composed to the reader. And interestingly, it's set, if you take my little writing there, right across from the engraving, and he tells you, but reader, look not on his picture, but his book. So sees this picture, which is gigantic, very, very large of an image for a writer, and right across from it you have this poem telling you not to look at it. A little bit strange. Well, it's actually very strange, but we won't go into that right now. But then Ben Jonson wrote of all the epistles and the dedicatoire thing, and there's a listing of the plays and that's in this introductory material. The most important of all was written by Ben Jonson. These are the most memorable lines: to the memory of my beloved, the author, Mr. William Shakespeare, and what he hath left us. And I will call your attention to a YouTube posting that really analyzes and goes through this incredible poem. As I said, the most memorable lines, and it's posted by Alexander Waugh, and many of you know of Mr. Waugh. He recently passed away, much to our loss. But look at that YouTube, and he will tell a lot, goes into a lot more very interesting points about this incredibly important poem to Mr. William Shakespeare and all he hath left us. Now, Ben Jonson, I believe, and many people have believed, that he was the editor, or maybe I like to think of him as more of the impresario of Shakespeare's First Folio. What are his credentials to do this? We talked about the actors. Did they have credentials? No education, no experience, no publishing. But Ben Jonson was a leading playwright of the era. No question about it. Jonson was the leading literary figure in London. In fact, he is called the dictator of the London literati. He was everybody's leader. Jonson was the court poet for the Stuart dynasty, which is King James, and then later King James's son, King Charles. So he is known as the king's poet. And because of that, King James paid him handsomely, 100 marks annually, which would have amounted to about $70,000 in today's money. However, as the First Folio is going into production, King James starts to pay him more, and later even more. So he's actually well reimbursed for whatever it is he's doing for the king. So what did he do for the king and the royal court? For King James and his queen, Queen Anne of Denmark, as she's known, and the royal administration. Well, he wrote all kinds of stuff. He did. He composed masques, poems, odes, verses, speeches, epigrams, and tributes all over the place. He had a lot of work to do because the court was very busy. They had to have, I'm not going to go through these, but this is a matter of just the entertainments that he wrote for the court. Some of them he wrote for special occasions. This one in particular he wrote for the speeches at Prince Henry's barriers. When Prince Henry, the son, had an important occasion, he wrote for marriages of important people who were being married under the auspices of the court. This doesn't even count all the plays that he wrote, but these are just entertainments, and this is one reason why he was being paid what was a lot of money to be paid at the time. So he also wrote plays, as we know, because he's a leading playwright of the time. And Heminges and Condell were members of the company that he wrote for. So the actors spoke the lines that Ben Jonson wrote. In fact, Ben Jonson was accustomed to putting words in the actors' mouths, and in a contemporary comment in a letter, someone had been to court and saw a play that the King's Men, the King's Company performed, and he wrote these words. He said that the actors, that an interlude was performed at the King's presence, and the actors spake. That's a good old-fashioned word. They spake such language as Ben Jonson hath put into their mouths. So basically, Ben Jonson's telling the actors what to say. I think he probably was telling them what to write too for these three parts of the introductory material, the dedicatoire to the two noblemen, and this sort of advertisement to the great variety of readers, which has their names printed down at the bottom and misspelled. Now, Jonson, did he have experience publishing? We know he's a writer. He wrote all kinds of stuff. In 1616, he published his own works in folio, which to this day, which was the earliest book that contained a collection of plays in England in folio-size book, in a folio-size form. A special credential that he had, that his biographers know about, is he took special interest in shepherding his own work through the publishing process. His biographers wrote that Jonson took a close and continuous interest throughout this period in the preparation of this volume, that's his 1616 works, which is coming about 7 years earlier than the First Folio Shakespeare, but he's publishing his own works in folio. And he was calling to Stansby, that's his printing house each morning to check the progress and supervise revisions. He was a hands-on writer to get his works through the press the way he wanted them to be. He has another credential. He is connected very closely with our two noble and incomparable pair of brethren, William and Philip. The Herbert brothers lavished patronage on Ben Jonson. And in turn, Ben Jonson lavished praise on the brothers and to their families. The Herberts, which was there, they were William Herbert and Philip Herbert, and the Sidneys, who were their cousins, first cousins. Just a few examples, and it's a lot more than this, but Jonson dedicated his play Catiline to Pembroke in 1611, and as you notice, you're in the workup, the marching up to the First Folio being printed in 1623. In 1612, Jonson dedicated his play The Alchemist to Lady Mary Sidney Roth. This is the Sidney family, who eventually became Pembroke's mistress. Pembroke gave £20 each year. Pembroke gave directly to Jonson, which Jonson called book money, which would have been about $20,000, which would buy a lot of books back then. In 1619, Pembroke presented Jonson with a master's degree from Oxford University, which he could do because he was Chancellor of Oxford University. We're talking really powerful people right here. Additional connections. Jonson was often a guest at the Sidneys, their first cousin, at their manor home called Penshurst. And it was the home of Sidney's uncle and political ally, Robert Sidney, who would later be the Earl of Leicester. Pembroke and his Sidney relatives were the most praised people of all in Jonson's very important set of poems called epigrams, and they are dedicated to Pembroke. So, I mean, they're as connected as you can get with all kinds of patronage going back and forth and back. By the early 1620s, the king's poet, I'm just summing up, I think I could say, and people would agree with this, he had the right connections and a proven track record of literary accomplishments. He was the king's poet, and he was very well connected with the two dedicatees, as we say, of the First Folio, who we believe underwrote and financed the First Folio. So it makes sense that this chancy venture, which was going to be as Charlton Hinman said, it was a chancy financial venture which could have ended up in great loss had it not been underwritten and put by these two men. And of course, they put it in Ben Jonson's very well proven and very capable hands. Now, the Shakespeare experts at the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C., do you think why did they leave out Ben Jonson? It's connected to the First Folio. In fact, they can't even bring themselves to mention Ben Jonson's name in any of their exhibitions. And as people went in 2016 few years ago to the exhibit as it went from university to university, they were looking, well, surely they were going to have a little thing saying, well, Ben Jonson was involved in this. But no, nothing. There has actually been a very, I would say, and I think some people would agree with me, a deliberate effort to remove Ben Jonson's presence from the First Folio. Another problem is that the task for preparing the plays for publication, not only was it going to be expensive and financially challenging venture, but the plays were likely to be somewhat dangerous because political satire and a great deal of sensitive personal information was freighted in the plays. In other words, wrapped up in it here and there, a lot of little subtle nuances, and these three men would have understood that very well. And they could have understood it, that it was seditious material, dangerous, without the help of hidden allusions to Shakespeare's plays, which is my own little personal joke because my mother edited the latest edition of this book. But what did the Folger librarian send to me? Oh, they just brought together, the plays were brought together by Shakespeare's friends and theater colleagues, but none of these people intervened in the text. They just simply gathered and set it out as it was given. The Folger would have us believe that there just was nothing much to it. Anybody who's hearing this believes that? 8 names appear in what we call that prefatory material to the Shakespeare First Folio, which is about 15 pages of information. To sum up what I've said already, I believe that the 2 actors, John Hemming, and he should have an S in his name, and Henry Condell, and this is misspelled, but even so, they're the cover story. They're the ones that are sort of the misdirection so that the average person who looks at this doesn't know what's going on. Ben Jonson is the impresario who's going to put it all together and be basically the editor-in-chief, the manager, and the Earls of Pembroke and Montgomery are the financiers. That is how I'm offering to you my proposal of how it's lined out. Now, added to this is Pembroke and Montgomery made the publication feasible due to the very high offices that they held in King James's royal administration. I don't think we could have gotten the plays together without their position and their extreme political power. Were other people involved in the process, or is it just those? Would it have been helpful for Jonson to have some input from some of his fellow literary associates, not his actors that he wrote words for, but other literary people when he was the dictator of the London group of writers, and there's no question about that. Here are the 3 tributes in the First Folio. One is by a man named Hugh Holland, another is put by L. Digges, which is Leonard Digges, and another is a mysterious I.M. And once again, I usually stands for the letter J, so we're looking at a writer who's going by his initials only. Now, the writers of these tributes, there's a very good overview of this, some of the things that I'm going to be telling you, in a book by Catherine Chiljan. And I suggest that you look at her book because she will give you a little more information and background in all of this. I believe, and Catherine and I have discussed this, we believe that these 3 writers, and whoever that is, Hugh Holland, Leonard Digges, that they contributed the verses, the 3 eulogists, and that they were his, what we would call, associate editors. That they had a hand, they were a team, and they had a hand in helping Ben Jonson with what we believe was a very big job. Of course, the Folger would disagree with that, but this is how we see it. Interestingly, if you read this, and I've read these tributes many times over many years, and it never fails to strike me how bad they are. I would use the words, to be on the more charitable side, they're not very inspiring tributes. You'd think writing a tribute to William Shakespeare could bring up a little bit better than this. So go read them if you haven't already. Most people hearing this probably have, and tell me what you think for yourself. But what you think about that. But I believe that they're mundane, commonplace, vacuous, and generally innocuous and unobtrusive. That's my list of adjectives to describe these 3 tributes. Obviously, they could have come up with something better, one might think. But why? I believe they're there. Why are these rather mundane and commonplace tributes there? I believe that they're there to give credit where credit is due to men who helped Ben Jonson and worked on the editorial process that was going to be a very arduous and commanding process for them of their time and effort. But they had to be kind of mundane and not too impressive because they couldn't upstage the boss, right? When the boss is going to write the great tribute that is there in the book. And to this day, possibly you could say the most memorable contemporary tribute to William Shakespeare. Ben Jonson. So they didn't upstage the boss. Again, I want to call your attention to Alexander Waugh's splendid YouTube presentation that will go more into why this tribute is so wonderful. To look at this from a little bit more of a historical angle, 9 years later, in 1632, there was a publication of the second folio of Shakespeare. It doesn't get as much attention as the first folio because we're very keen on first folios in this day and age. But the second folio is very interesting because it had extensive editorial changes from the first folio with only 9 years to do the job. In 1937, if that's clear enough, there was a book published by these two people who went through and did a very intricate comparison of the first folio and the second folio, and they came up with 1,700 changes from the first folio to the second folio 9 years later. Now, what I think this indicates is when more than half of the plays in the first folio never having been published, they had a lot of changes to take, whatever they had, and we don't know, whatever manuscripts or copies that they had to edit. And that surely they had a lot of work to do to get it in the first folio, and then they still kept working on it. We don't know who made all the changes from the first folio to the second folio. But what we do, this is an example of very deliberate editorial alterations. There were 459 changes in the grammar, 374, I know this is a little boring, but this is important information, 374 changes affecting the thought. I mean, they were deep into what the text that Shakespeare, whoever he was, wrote. 359 changes affecting the meter, changes affecting the style, and changes to the action that the play was going on. Who were these editors that came in again and made more changes? Well, these editors, according to one database that I looked at, they were considered quite competent in their classical and mythological knowledge. So they knew what they were doing, and I offer to you that they were very probably the same men that worked on the first folio, because they were all still living and that they kept on working on it and continued to make improvements and get more into the depth of things because they knew what they were doing, having worked very hard with Ben Jonson. And Ben Jonson may have had a hand in this too. But I offer to you that you're looking at the same team for the second folio, and there was still quite a lot of work to be done. They also, yes, they were quite competent, no question about it. So who are these guys? These editors that I'm proposing to you. Hugh Holland was a long-standing friend from Jonson's school days. They had both attended the same school under the very great headmaster William Camden. Camden himself had highly praised them both. In fact, he seemed to have considered them his two best students, Jonson and Holland. And Hugh Holland was a member of Jonson's Mermaid Tavern crowd, and he was pretty much his wingman. When Jonson got into some hot water with something going on in the tavern, it was Hugh Holland who came to his rescue and straightened it out and got the matter settled in a nice way, so there was no problem for Ben Jonson. Leonard Digges. I know that sounds like a funny name to us now. And he's sort of brushed off by historians that he was sort of an insignificant person. No. Leonard Digges came from an extremely well-established family in the intelligentsia for 3 generations. His grandfather was a leading astronomer, which was a big deal back then, a mathematician, and a friend of Dr. John Dee. Now, for those of you, some of you, the name Dr. John Dee strikes terror in our heart because we know what an incredible person this was, and a lot of study goes into Dr. John Dee. Dr. John Dee raised and educated Leonard's father, whose name was Thomas, and who was also a writer and a mathematician and astronomer. Thomas Digges was a close associate and supporter of Robert Dudley, somebody else that we need to know about. Many of you do. For those who don't, he's really regarded as one of the Machiavellian figures around the court of Queen Elizabeth, but I won't go into that for now. The Earl of Leicester was the godfather of Leonard's older brother, Sir Dudley Digges, who was an extremely important administrative and member of King James Royal Court and a member of Parliament. He was a very important official in the administration of the time. So what we have here, I'm going to kind of skip over this slide because I'm not going to, as to how intricately they were all connected. Basically, what you're looking at with Leonard Digges and I'd have to say of the three tributes, this one is probably a little better than the other two, but you're looking at the power elite, and they're represented by the younger brother of the famous Sir Dudley Digges, and he is representative of this extremely important family triumvirate, I call it, the Dudleys, the Sidneys, and the Herberts. So you have very powerful people who want to know what's going on, and are involved in it, for however much we don't know. The mysterious I Am, for this very short and the third tribute, it was originally thought that was a playwright named John Marston. Later, for the 20th century, it's decided that it is a writer named James Mabie. And there are very good reasons why it could be either one of these people. I personally would suggest that it is both Marston and Mabie, and that is covered by two men making up his initials. But the reason for John Marston, and this has kind of been forgotten because people have turned their attention away from John Marston in recent times. He was a dramatist who collaborated with Ben Jonson. They go back a long way. Ben Jonson, John Marston. And he also incorporated a number of things from Shakespeare's plays into his own works. He also he hid behind a pseudonym, and he also hid behind his initials. This play is written by an I Am. And so it just suggests to me that if someone were looking at I Am and they know they're looking at a book of plays and they knew playwrights and what was going on in the theaters in Elizabethan England, they might make the connection that the I Am was John Marston. So I just suggest that. Marston, of course, had a reason to hide behind his initials, though actually James Mabie did too, because both men had troublesome lives off and on along the way. And Marston had by the time of the First Folio, he had become a clergyman, and he was giving what they called a church living, and those were much sought after at that time. So to hide behind his initials would make some sort of sense. And of course, just about everybody who's working on this knows the danger of political satire. But again, I see no reason why I Am couldn't be both of these men, which would mean that Ben Jonson had four men, in addition to the three that we see, and possibly a fourth team member that is going to work on this problem of bringing together the plays and editing them and getting them reasonably set for the general public to look at them. I believe that these are the editors who are hiding in plain sight. Now, where might these four men, Ben Jonson, the three tributers, and possibly John Marston, if he is the I Am, where would they be? Where would they hang out? They got to have some place to work and to work together, because this is going to be serious work, I suggest. What they would need, they'd need a place large enough to house four and maybe five men. They would need a lodging that would let them have a place to lodge and work, and working space to work in. They would need to have private and secure surroundings. They need support personnel, someone to provide them with food and beverage. And we're told that Ben Jonson was very fond of beverage. They had to be and maintain them in comfortable living environment. Could such a facility or place even exist in Elizabethan London, or by this time we're Jacobean London? Yes. I suggest to you that the place is Gresham College. This is what Gresham College looked like at the time. It was a huge home, and this little diagram up here tells you where the reading rooms are and the apartments are, and where all the important places that this institution, this facility had. Gresham College had been the mansion home of Sir Thomas Gresham. He was the financier for Queen Elizabeth, and he founded the extremely important institution called the Royal Exchange. Just an incredible financial genius. When Gresham died in 1579, he left his great mansion home, which is this, to the City of London and to the Mercers' Company that he had been a part of. He had been a member of the Mercers' Company. In his will, he gave detailed instructions for the property, which was this great home, to be turned into an institution for higher learning, and a college after the decease of his wife, who lived 20 more years. She lived here for 20 more years. But as soon as she passed away, the mayor of London and the city of London and the Mercer's Company all got together, and within months they had put in place the terms of Thomas Gresham's will to transform what had been a home into what would be a facility of a college, so to speak. But it wasn't going to be a regular college. This is exactly the way Thomas Gresham had it in his will. Gresham College would not function like a normal college did. It would not enroll students. It would not award degrees. What it would be, this was his vision, that his home would become a center for free lectures on important academic subjects to be given on specific days and open to the general public. What he wanted to do, he was a great philanthropist, and he had made all this money, and he wanted to use it in such a way to contribute to the education of anybody who wanted education who lived at that time in London. It's an incredible vision, and to offer to people who obviously weren't going to get to go to college, maybe they could have gone to a grammar school, but to give, they offer the benefits of higher learning to the general public and population of London. Just incredible. It was an incredible foresight that he had. And he even specified there were to be 7 subjects and 7, quote, learned men who would live there in apartments on the college. And they would live there and they would work, and they had study places where they could study and prepare, and then they would give their lectures on their assigned subject at specific times, and they would get a salary of £50 a year, which was a very nice salary for an academic to receive at that point in time. The funds to maintain the building and pay for the professors and their stipend and the people who, the administration staff, the staff who looked after them, they came from rents from the shops located in the Royal Exchange, which Thomas Gresham had founded. It's incredible thinking and a vision for the future that is just magnificent. Now, what I'm going to tell you about now comes from these 3 books that I've talked about, which tells you all about Ben Jonson. And all of these 3 biographies are written by extremely fine historians. The first one that I read was this one. And this information was so slided over, it was so oblique that I didn't pick up on it when I read it the first time. I picked up on it later when I read Ian Donaldson, and then I went back to this one, and this is the one that talks the most about this very interesting little fact. It comes from a court record, and it was discovered in 1951 by a very fine historian academic at the time named C.J. Sisson. And it gives us a remarkable, unbelievable piece, what I call a serendipity, to know about something going on in Ben Jonson's life. Here it is. This is the court record. We can talk about it in a second, just to give you the overview. I know it's hard to read, it's in secretary hand, and this is a very difficult secretary hand to read. I've worked on it, but Professor Sisson, who had actually found it, gives a pretty good overview and translation of what you'll see here. However, interestingly, it's signed, this is Ben Jonson's deposition, and it's signed here by Ben Jonson. And I have verified his signature with W.W. Gregg's early English literary signatures, autographs, and that is very definitely Ben Jonson's signature. Now, however, in the books, they didn't tell me where to go to find the document. They only cited this article that appeared in 1951. I tried to get it on the internet and couldn't. It's hard to, I couldn't get that time and that date to come up. And so I called a friend of mine who lives in Pennsylvania. His name is Marty Hyatt, and he's a genius at finding things on the internet. And I asked Dr. Hyatt if he would help me find it, and if I could impose on his time, which was quite an imposition, because he had to go to 2 research libraries to get this. This was not easy to come by. It didn't just pop up because you clicked around a little bit. The first one that he went to, they had it in their files, but he couldn't get it to download and print. So he went another week, he went to another research library of another university, and he found this article. I needed this article because in it is the PRO numbers for the court case that this document comes from. I couldn't get this if I didn't have the numbers, the court, they call PRO number. That's PRO stands for Public Records Office. If I didn't have the Public Records Office number, I couldn't have found this. But then, once I had it, I contacted a researcher in England, a professional researcher, with the numbers, and he went into the National Archives, and he found the whole court case, and he sent me the entire court case. It's about 100 pages, all very difficult to read, but it's very, very interesting. What has our attention, though, is this particular document. Because up here, and I'm sorry that it's a little hard to get it really clear on this, it says the 20th day of October, 1623. And it also has at the top, this is Benjamin Jonson's handwriting. Again, I verified this. Benjamin Jonson of Gresham, and this is all in Ben Jonson's handwriting. And then the clerk of the court started with college in London. He said, look, Mr. Jonson, this is my job to write up what's going on here. But you've got Ben Jonson's signature on this twice, which is really kind of nice. But what it says is, what's important is, of course, this date. On October 20th, 1623, Ben Jonson was examined as a witness in a lawsuit. That's your lawsuit. In the Court of Chancery, the lawsuit was brought by Elizabeth Lady Raleigh, the widow of Sir Walter Raleigh. This very important person, for many of you know Sir Walter Raleigh, had been one of the most significant people in the reign of Queen Elizabeth. But King James didn't like him very much, so he was eventually, for most of the time, he was a prisoner in the Tower of London. And at any rate, there was a lawsuit about his settlement of the estate for his widow was disputed, and she had to go to court to fight to get whatever she thought she should have had. And after the execution of her husband, and by the way, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, the execution of Sir Walter Raleigh is one of the great tragedies of this particular era. Jonson was called. And the reason he's in this deposition, in this lawsuit, because he was called to testify as a friend of the Raleigh family and to testify to the authenticity of Sir Walter's letters, his handwriting and his letters, which he could do because Jonson had spent a year with Sir Walter Raleigh's son in Europe. So he knew the letters and correspondence well. He begins this deposition, as I've already mentioned, Benjamin Jonson of Gresham College in London, gent, aged 50 years and upwards. There is no question that we have Mr. Benjamin Jonson here. We have our Ben. If you'll look, and here are the two signatures. Here we have Benjamin Jonson up at the top left and his signature down at the bottom right. It has been pointed out to me, although I already noticed it. He puts his full name here and he puts the H back in his name, whereas his literary name, I would say this was his literary name as a writer, and this must have been his legal name that he still was known as, because the handwritings match. I've worked on them, and they are exactly the same person. So we know that two things stand out. The date, October 20th, 1623. This was the date, this puts Jonson in the fall of 1623 when the printing of the First Folio is going through its final stages in the press. He's at Gresham College. Now, maybe it's important to know, maybe he just thought he could say he was at Gresham College because he stopped by a few times to have a cup of tea with some of the professors there. But I don't think so, because depositions, which is what this is, they were sworn testimony under oath, and people took sworn testimony very, very seriously. And I suggest that he did consider himself with a close association with the college. What was that association? According to David Riggs, he seems to think that Jonson may have resided at Gresham College after his return from Scotland in 1619, which would mean that by this time he'd been living at Gresham College for 4 years by the time of the deposition. But Jonson's biographers, including the other two, can't figure out what Jonson was doing if he was in residence at Gresham College. It's all the more puzzling because the records of Gresham College, which were very well kept, extreme details of who was there, they were meticulously kept, as I have here, through the centuries, and they do not have a single word about Ben Jonson. And you can check this book out. It was published in 1740, giving a lot of information about all of remember, there were 7 professors that were there, teaching 7 very important academic subjects, and they had other people with them and taking care of them. We don't know a thing of what Ben Jonson was doing at Gresham College, but I suggest to you, because of the deposition taken under oath, that he was indeed there. Not a trace, my statement here is supported by Donaldson, who is a very fine historian. He says there's not a trace of mention of Ben Jonson in the Gresham College records. The lack of notice is even more suspicious because in 1623, Ben Jonson was at the very top of his career. At this point, he had been well established as the King's poet. He was a leader of the London literati. The whole London literary people looked up to him. And so this suggests to me that whatever the King's poet and his team, and I've suggested to you who I believe the team was. They're the tributes people who wrote the tributes in the First Folio, introduction material. They're kept at Gresham College, but the whole thing is being kept very quiet. However, Gresham College is perfect for them. They've got apartments to live in. They've got meeting space to work in. In fact, one of the largest and best libraries in London was at Gresham College. They had a staff to provide for them, food and drink, and take care of them. What a wonderful way to work. All paid for by, all the expenses paid for the editors would have been paid for out of the funds that Sir Thomas Gresham provided for the college. But I believe that this can be looked upon for this reason as a sub rosa enterprise conducted there at Gresham. Or you can believe what the Folger Shakespeare Librarian would like for us to believe, that the actors simply gathered and set the text as it was given. I rest my case.